Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Citrix featuring Forrester, the new state of business continuity strategy. This is an installment of Remote Works, a Citrix virtual series examining the best practices, lessons learned, and realities of a remote work world. My name is Darlene Jaramillo, and I will be your host for today's presentation. Our featured speakers for today are Carissa Stringer, Senior Director of Citrix Workspace Marketing at Citrix, and Andrew Hewitt, Analyst serving infrastructure and operations professionals at Forrester. Before we get started, let me cover a couple of housekeeping details. We will have a dedicated question and answer session at the end of today's presentation and invite you to submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the Ask a Question window in the webinar interface. Also, this event is being recorded and a link to the on-demand version will be sent to everyone in a follow-up email. With that, I will now hand it over to Carissa to start the presentation. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Darlene, and thanks, Andrew, for joining us. We're so excited to have you here today. So just to kind of kick it off, what we're looking to talk about as we kind of go through this presentation. So obviously on the Citrix side, we're very excited to have Andrew join us. I know, Andrew, you've done a lot of research when it comes to what are the phases of a pandemic, the phases of remote work. So we're excited to have you share that research with us. And then really kind of looking back, we have this wonderful, unique opportunity where you've helped so many customers through the last few months here. So very much looking forward to you sharing some of the lessons learned from the initial stages of the pandemic, a little bit more about how business continuity, where maybe we thought it was just this temporary state, has quickly become the new norm, and what that means for this remote workforce. And of course, as we look towards the future, what are the plans post-pandemic and into the next wave of remote working for us. So thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Carissa. Thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. As you know, remote working has been a huge topic for so many organizations and individuals over the past couple of months, and I've actually been covering it since 2017. So we're finally sort of getting into the limelight in terms of the remote work research. It's really good to see a lot of interest in organizations trying to make this transition as smoothly as they can and thinking about it much more broadly than they did in the past. It's really becoming a business continuity issue rather than just kind of a nice to have employee experience benefit, which I think it traditionally has been. So I'm going to dive into a lot of that research today, and we're going to have a really good back and forth conversation too. You'll hear a little bit about what Citrix is doing, as well as my perspective from the Forrester side of things, and we'll give a good perspective in terms of what do we see this future of work actually looking like, given everything that we've gone through over the past 2.5 months. So Forrester has really outlined 4 major stages of the pandemic. So phase 1 was infection. That happened at the beginning of January into February, basically the first 2 months. The second phase was social distancing, which is happening through March, April, and now is just starting to fade away a little bit as we get into the mid part of May. Where we're heading into now is this, what we're calling the management phase, which is where a lot of companies are going to start thinking about, okay, I just made this giant transition. How do I optimize this? How do I build this into my future strategy as a company? And what are the most important things I should think about from a technology perspective, from an employee experience perspective, from a management, from a culture perspective? So we're having all sorts of different conversations about that. And finally, that fourth phase is eradication, right? And nobody really knows when this eradication phase is happening. The key indicator here is a vaccine. And what does the world look like post-vaccine? And we do not believe it's going to look the same. And I think a lot of organizations believe that as well. So we're going to have a big transition in terms of how we think about business continuity, how we think about remote working, flexible work styles, all of that. So we're actually going to hit in all 4 of these stages today and talk about some of the major things that we've learned in the earlier stages, as well as what we should start to think about as we go forward. So On the next slide here, I want to introduce you just some of the things that we learned during phases 1 and phases 2, infection and social distancing. And one of the things that Forrester did very early on with this entire pandemic is we said we really want to track this on a bi-weekly basis. So we launched what we call our Pandemic EX survey. And it started out in the US, but now has expanded to, I believe, 8 or 9 different countries across the world. And essentially, this is a set of questions that we're fielding every 2 weeks to learn about what is the perception of employees as they're navigating this experience. And it includes things like remote working, and includes things like, just overall perceptions and emotions regarding this, leadership, things of that nature. And I want to share just a couple of the interesting insights that came out of that first Pandemic EX survey, and some of the following waves that we've done as a part of this. So the first thing to note here is that 88% of business continuity decision makers said they had a remote access solution in place prior to this pandemic, right? Majority said that they had something in place to enable remote working in the event of a pandemic. Just 3% of those organizations actually said we've executed a business continuity plan in the context of a pandemic itself, whether that was H1N1 or SARS or any other different types of diseases that might be out there. So people basically thought that they were ready for this. But what the Pandemic EX survey showed was that during the first week of March, just 47% of US workers said their company had the technology to actually support remote work. So there's a big gap between what people thought they were ready for and what they were actually ready for. And we saw it in a number of different cases with our clients, and with those who aren't clients. For example, the state of Colorado spending over millions of dollars for 1,800 laptops for their remote workforce that they sent home very rapidly. We had big banks literally shipping workstations of traders to the home and getting them set up. We had small government agencies that were trying to rewrite access databases so that employees could access them from their home offices, and in some cases that was a bit of a public safety hazard, because a lot of what government organizations were trying to do was pull permits for things like funerals and cremations. So trying to make that transition very quickly and at scale was really what was very difficult for a lot of these organizations going forward. So I think what we've learned from this pandemic so far is that even if you think that you're ready, you need to think about the scale and how rapidly you can bring up these contingent plans in the event of one of these pandemics happening again. So I think the biggest thing that we have learned is really that companies thought they were prepared, but they really weren't for this level of pandemic.
No, that's great. And I think you hit that word scale a couple of times. So if you're doing this reflection, Andrew, and it's great you have all this research to share with us, but what really separated the leaders from the laggards in this phase 1 and phase 2?
Absolutely. So if I think about this as, during these phases, there's really 3 major areas. And one was around infrastructure readiness, so technology. Another was around cultural readiness. What types of things did you have in place to support trust of the workforce, which we're going to get to a little bit later, as well as your familiarity with structure of remote work. Did you have work styles in place that people had that muscle memory to be able to go and work remotely? For those large consulting organizations, right, that was no problem. People have been traveling and working remotely for decades in that industry. But for others, like financial services, that was not the case. But I think in terms of making this transition quickly, it really was the technology piece that really bubbled to the surface at the beginning. And there were a couple of things that we saw as very common issues. One was, did you have laptops that you could have people bring home, or were you connected to a very heavy workstation or desktop environment that was very hard to move? We've heard horror stories of organizations packing up these workstations and spending weekends getting them ready and sanitizing them and sending them out. And that not having that mobile strategy in place made this very difficult. The other thing was access solutions and over-reliance specifically on on-prem access solutions. So things like VPN servers, for example. We talked to one large organization, university, that basically increase their VPN capacity from, I think, about 1,000 users to 20,000 users over the course of a single weekend. And getting all those servers up and running and deployed and configured and all the licensing for that was a tremendous lift for them. So the infrastructure readiness in terms of how much of my employee-facing applications have I moved to cloud, how much of the access solutions am I relying on on-prem servers, those types of things tend to be the biggest issues for companies and where they had the most difficult making these transitions. There are also things around security of remote environments, doing things like patching. We had a lot of clients who essentially didn't have any strategy for BYOD and didn't have a way to determine whether a random personally owned device accessing their network was compliant and had all the right security protocols and didn't have any malware on it. So there was definitely a huge push on how do I get visibility over things that are connected to my network. And the organizations that had made that shift to cloud in terms of the employee-facing apps had a scalable infrastructure that was cloud-based. And it had solutions to be able to support something like a BYOD environment without jeopardizing the security of the organization. We're much better able to handle this increased load, this transition, and they're able to do it not only securely, but fast too. I talked to some of the leading organizations who said it wasn't an issue. We got the call to go work remotely, and 2 days later, 80% of the workforce was at home, and we were phasing out a couple other groups. But for the most part, we were able to do it in 2 to 3 days, right? For other organizations, that hasn't been the case. I've still talked to some big banks that they still have some employees that they can't provide that remote access to. So I really think it is about that infrastructure overall, in addition to some of the cultural and structural elements that we'll talk about later.
No, that's great. And it's a great segue just to touch on, the Citrix aspect of a secure digital workspace. So obviously for many of the organizations I'm sure you've spoken with, and obviously, Andrew, how you and I have gotten to be friends over the last few years here, yeah. Citrix is very much an integral part of a lot of organizations' business continuity strategy. And that is largely because of our ability to deliver a secure digital workspace. So, not to drill into it in a ton of details, but I think you touched on a lot of those aspects, right? How can I safely and securely give access to Windows applications, my SaaS and web applications, files, whether that's on a device that my corporation can manage for me, or it could just be a personal device that I had located at home. So I thought it'd be worthwhile just to click through and highlight some of those key components that make up that Citrix digital workspace. So the first one that I wanted to talk through is virtualization. I will say in my experience from lessons learned, and of course they're mostly speaking with existing Citrix customers, virtualization has played a huge part of, previous business continuity plans as well as scaling out for the pandemic. If you're new to virtualization, or even maybe you're new to Citrix, I thought I'd just highlight some of the key things that make it so powerful in this situation. So the first one is the ability for IT to actually centrally deploy and manage all the business applications and desktops. So essentially, nothing is actually running on an endpoint device. The user seamlessly interacting remotely with that business application. So it makes it super easy from employees from home over whatever device they have running at home. They're able to safely and securely access their business applications because they're virtualized, right? They're not running on that endpoint. They're running back, whether it's on cloud infrastructure or within their on-premises data center. So that's one of the key advantages. But then since we were kind of taking a lessons learned approach, I wanted to walk you through some of the lessons learned that we had regarding virtualization. So the first one was, how do you deploy these virtualization solutions? Today, a lot of our customers have a traditional, what we call on-premises deployment. They're managing, their individual components related to a virtual desktop or a virtual application. They're also doing all of the Citrix management components. They're deploying and managing those on their own. To your point, Andrew, where you were facing infrastructure limitations and learning to scale, that was a key limitation that a lot of individuals were facing in a traditional on-premises deployment. When you look at our other option, which is actually the ability to deliver virtual apps and virtual desktops from a cloud service, now Citrix takes care of all the management of our components. You as the IT provider only need to be concerned with your business applications, your business desktops. And if you run into infrastructure limitations, now you have the infrastructure of the cloud where you're able to integrate, whether it's any public cloud provider, and dial up or scale out your business applications and desktops from there. The other thing that became very interesting as we're helping all these customers go through this experience was even the cloud sometimes faced limitations regarding infrastructure. I heard more about it probably over in Europe than I did on the US side. But what we were able to realize, and you kind of even mentioned it, or it just could have been the use case. We have maybe it's a financial industry or someone who's made a very big investment in a high-powered physical workstation that's sitting underneath their desktop in the office. So how do you integrate that into this solution? So we've seen a huge uptick in interest where, work from home users are actually able to remote into that physical PC that's sitting in the office. And then the key benefit there is they're able to use all those high performance capabilities, remote access and security benefits to interact with the desktop. So, from an IT perspective, you have a centralized view of who's accessing what when to really promote security. So a lot of people were going with that angle as an alternative to VPNs, just like you highlighted. But I talked about that digital workspace being about all your applications, not just virtual applications, but SaaS and web applications, even mobile applications as well. And that's why I did want to take a moment to highlight our kind of VPN Less approach to SaaS and internal web applications. So this topic of VPN, hopefully, Andrew, you can dig into a little bit more here, but it's very interesting. Just like you said, a lot of people said, okay, my remote strategy is to scale up my VPNs. Well, of course, there are security risks that are associated with that. So within a Citrix digital workspace, what we're able to do here is actually restrict access. So from just the user's device to that specific application, whether it's the SaaS app or it's an internal web application. And then we start layering on additional security controls. So we're able to do single sign-on through any identity provider, whether, again, it's a SaaS or internal web app. We have a whole set of security policies that we can then apply to prevent a user from printing or copying and pasting or even taking pictures of that. And like I said, we give the option of a managed or unmanaged device. And in the event that unmanaged device may potentially have malware, like a keylogger or something that could capture screens, we can actually prevent that as well. The last one that I want to call is maybe you have navigated to your SaaS application and somewhere, somehow, someone has introduced risky websites. Now, if you were to click on one of those risky websites, we've also introduced web filtering capabilities. So just a few high-level components that talk about, alternatives to VPNs. And again, the alternative doesn't mean you have to virtualize it. We can do the same thing with a traditional SaaS or internal web app. And then the last piece, which is the part where I'm really excited to talk about, is our analytics capability. So Citrix is so uniquely positioned if you really think about it, right? So we know a little bit about the end user's device, the network that they're connecting across, and not just one application, but the variety of applications and data that they're interacting with. So this gives us the ability to overall assess both the security of the environment at an individual level by identifying a risk score for each user, as well as a performance score that can kind of showcase how well is the environment performing for that individual user. So let's go ahead and go back to maybe one of my favorite topics here, Andrew, which is I love to hear your opinion a little bit about how organizations are thinking about VPNs and really other technologies going forward.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite questions and something we've been getting quite a bit recently. So I would say there's two elements of this. One is the reality of what's happening now, and two, where do people want to go in the future? The reality of what's happening now is that people are really using the things that they're used to, right? In this time of anxiety and stress, it can be very hard to go and innovate and replace something that you're used to. So what we've seen with VPN specifically is that people have defaulted to it. They've built out the servers to it. We've seen some data, for example, Horizon said that they had seen 39% increase in VPN usage since March 1st on their service. So we are definitely seeing organizations continuing to use VPN for remote access. That being said, there's been a couple of things that have come out of it. One, which is something we already talked about, which was scalability. It's very difficult to go and configure and spin up a bunch of VPN servers and do that in a way that is agile enough to support a transition that's this rapid. The other element is around security itself. You can, if you think about traditional VPN, it's very much in line with the old school perimeter model of security, where essentially you have your castle, you have your wall that surrounds that castle, you have your moat that surrounds that castle, and as soon as someone crosses that moat and breaks down your wall, they're directly into your kingdom, right? So the big thing with VPN that people are saying is, I don't want to give the user direct full access to my kingdom, my corporate network, by providing them that direct link, right? So a lot of organizations have been saying, I want to improve the security of my access by doing this on a user to application basis. So only showing users those applications that are available to them and having them authenticate to those applications. And that doesn't mean that they're requiring a password for each one of these. I think you touched upon single sign-on, Carissa, where it's easy to do through a combination of digital certificates, through biometrics and things. I can authenticate to those services. But the point is, I'm doing it to a user to application basis as opposed to user to the entire network basis. So I think that security element is something that people are really starting to think about when it comes to VPN. And the other thing is around user experience, right? People accessing that VPN on networks that aren't very fast, right? Having to tunnel through, get into the data center. It can be a slow, latent experience. Oftentimes, every time that you start a VPN session, you need to log in, put in your credentials, and it can just be kind of a clunky user experience, right? A lot of folks are saying, one, I could leverage the virtualization as a replacement for that. I could leverage what Carissa was talking about, which is that combination of single sign-on with certificate management with biometrics. What do I have versus what do I know? Bringing those two things together and providing that seamless experience. And there are other solutions too, in terms of what we call zero trust network access solutions too, where you're looking at that, cloud-based VPN alternative that would provide that user application basis. So I think there's a lot of momentum coming from different areas of the market that are trying to tackle VPN. And obviously there are other areas too that people are thinking about. Certainly I've seen a lot of interest in cloud desktops. Remote PC access is definitely something that has come up for sure. Particularly, as you mentioned, Chris, on the workstations, big banks, trying to remote into those systems rather than packing them up, bringing them home. And I would say the other major element of this too is, how do I simplify the management of the actual devices that I have? Can I use a unified endpoint management solution to have a single view over all the devices that I have, use cloud-based MDM APIs to manage them, get away from some of the traditional things that people use when they're trying to manage PCs and other devices out there. So I think there is a bit of a sea change in terms of people finally realizing that they need to use more innovative cloud-based technologies to, one, be more scalable, two, be more secure, and three, to provide that better end user experience too.
No, it's great feedback, great insights, and a lot to really process, Andrew. So I appreciate that guidance. So now I'll go ahead and say, now that we've done a little bit of looking backwards, right? Bring us up to speed on what you're seeing today.
Sure, absolutely. So we're in this management phase where we're starting to make this transition, depending on where you're logging in from. If you've just gone into lockdown, 6 weeks ago, then it's probably you're still in that kind of social distancing phase. Although where I live in Colorado, United States, we're starting to move out of that phase and providing people, more access to go outside and things of that nature. So we're making that transition, and companies are starting to think about, how do I start to bring people back, as part of this? So as we enter this management phase, there are a couple of things that you want to think about. And the first thing is, I don't want to be unempathetic here and not acknowledge that organizations are in different places when it comes to this, right? If you are in one of these three modes, your response to how you handle this next management phase, which is all around optimization and looking back and trying to figure out what's the best way to go forward, your response is going to be different depending on how bad this COVID-19 pandemic has hit you. So we've identified basically three types of organizations. You have your survival mode organizations where you've really been hit hard. You're seeing rapidly declining revenues. And the impetus for these types of groups is really to try to focus on technologies that you can use to automate and save costs in the long term, just to keep yourself afloat. And that's where those optimizations are going to happen. For those organizations that are more in the adaptive mode, let's say you've had some impacts to your revenue, but there haven't been necessarily, giant layoffs. You've been able to send people home. The impact of the business is definitely real, but you have a little extra cash to be able to say, okay, how can I be a little bit more flexible? Some organizations are going to be in that phase, and I think probably the majority of them, where they're looking at how do I make things just a little bit better. An example would be, we had a customer that was using a Citrix XenApp, solution, and it was working really great for them. They needed to roll this out in remote work, so they were able to actually invest a little extra money to get some more authentication for their systems to enable people to access that remotely. It's not something they had set up beforehand, but because they weren't as hit hard by the pandemic, they're able to make that shift very quickly. So if you're in that adaptive mode, you're really thinking about flexibility and trying to do it as low cost as possible. If you're one of the rare organizations that is in growth mode, let's say your company creates hand sanitizer, something like that, right? You have a little bit extra cash to be able to go and improve and focus on things like speed, scalability. We've seen organizations where if this is the case, they got rid of their VPN and ended up, going with another solution that would be easier for them to manage in the future, and they're sort of making that transition. So just to say that your response is going to be different, and just because we say invest in certain things doesn't mean that we're saying your organization should absolutely do this. It would definitely depend on what the unique circumstances are that you have. And I think one of the other big things that we're seeing in the management phase is now that we've got through this initial transition, the problems are starting to change. So if we look at technology specifically, I mentioned earlier on that satisfaction with technology and preparedness with technology was in the 40% across the globe, 47% in the United States, and similar in other countries as well. Now, 65% of U.S. workers say they have the technology they need to work remotely. No more than 15% of them are reporting technology-related issues. And by those issues, I mean things like video conferencing dropping out, audio conference dropping out, people not muting themselves, not having a laptop, things of that nature. Less than 15% across all of those different categories. So basically, the technology experience is okay. We've gotten to a place where we can move forward. It's not a drastic issue right now. So what I think is the impact of that is that focus of what we need to improve is now starting to change. And it's changing specifically from technology over to people. So if we go back to our pandemic EX survey, the data shows that people are afraid. If we ask people, indicate how much you agree or disagree with each of the statements describing your thoughts about the coronavirus. And this is specifically to multiple waves of data. And this is specific to U.S. workers. 70% of them in the first week of April say, I am afraid of the spread of the coronavirus. 79% say, I expect my life will be disrupted by coronavirus. 50% say, I'm afraid to go to work because of the risk of exposure. And we just recently got the data back, and we're seeing similar results for the beginning of May as well. So this is not remote working as usual. This is a remote working in which people are afraid, they're stressed out, they're managing multiple different things at once. And that responsibility for the organization is, one, enable them from a technology perspective first, which I think we've mostly done. And secondly, how do I provide additional resources to help those people overcome the unique stressors of this remote work environment?
No, those are great insights and really puts a nice kind of personal touch. I think each of us can relate to how you would react when you think about, those questions over the course of the last few months. But so, Andrew, now that we're kind of thinking this more people-centric approach, how can organizations keep employee engagement high as this long-term reality kind of sets in?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's probably the most common question I'm getting right now specifically. I'm talking to about 10 to 15 companies a week who are asking questions similar to this. And I think right now what has bubbled up as being very important is what are the acute issues that people are dealing with, and can you actually, as a business, make an investment to improve it? And that's the key, actually spending money. It's not really enough to say, block off your calendar so you have better work-life balance, right? Employees, they don't necessarily see that as an investment in their overall well-being. Organizations are making specific investments to help people manage this time. I talked to one large consulting organization a couple of weeks ago, and they've actually hired an outside psychologist to come in that will do Q&A sessions with employees to manage the stress of social distancing. So that's an actual investment of bringing someone in to provide extra help. I talked to another, technology provider who is basically doing free mental health counseling for people, as well as providing, extra telehealth capabilities for people who are sick or who are dealing with sick loved ones. So there's an investment that people are making. Certainly, there's things around, social communities and trying to bring people together. I talked to one client that's doing a regional wine night, once per week. It's every Thursday, I believe, where, they pick a wine from a certain country and people talk about it. Things of that nature. Forrester is doing a really interesting concert series where we have a very musically inclined culture. So we're bringing people together, they're playing music, sharing it on our social platforms, and it's a pretty cool, fun experience. So I'm finding a lot of organizations are actually taking the time to provide those types of communities. And the other thing, which I think is an acute issue here too, is childcare, tutoring responsibilities. And we've seen organizations devote portions of their staff to actually doing things like reading stories to children during certain times when the parents are working, or investing in tools to foster online learning so the parents don't have to do that. Or even in some cases, I talked to another company that is contracting with some of the mobile applications that do food delivery. So in the US, it's like Grubhub and Dashdoor, and they're providing actually money for people to go use those services so they don't have to cook for their kids at home. So there's an acute issue here that companies need to make this investment to help reduce some of these demands on employees' time. Outside of kind of those more people-focused things that are more sort of emotional, anxiety-driven, those types of things, there's a couple other things I think that organizations are thinking about, as they're going into this management phase. And one is trying to level this playing field between the office and the remote workforce. So as organizations are starting to say, I'm going to bring some of my people back, they'll run into one of the traditional issues with remote working, which is people feeling left out. And how do I preserve context? How do I preserve social inclusion with technology? So there's been a couple of interesting technologies that have bubbled up to the surface. One is around virtual worlds, where you actually provide a digital version of the office, of your physical office, in basically a web browser, and everybody has their own avatar. And you can walk around and talk to people and, have these social one-off ad hoc conversations. So those types of things, collaboration on digital whiteboards, for instance, and being able to mimic that experience of working on something with someone on a whiteboard in the office. Tools that can help, digital workspace types of capabilities that provide access to information in a consolidated area, right? To reduce that context switching. We know people are pretty overwhelmed by video conferencing and things of that nature, but bringing all that information together has been a big area where people are interested in investing in this. Of course, there's an element, and Chris, you had mentioned it too, around performance analytics and kind of experience optimization. I'm finding a lot of clients are saying, I've moved a bunch of my users home and they're, virtualization users. I want to understand what that performance is like. I want to understand any bottlenecks or issues that people are having. So more focus on the analytics piece. That goes for the physical PC as well. Interest in what I call end user experience management platforms, where you're looking at, the health of devices, blue screens of death, latency, application crashes, all of those sorts of things. So there's definitely a focus on kind of monitoring. And of course, as we talked about earlier, investigating some of those alternative technology, whether that's VPN, whether it's moving from an on-prem virtualization solution to the cloud, or looking at different ways to manage devices, different ways to secure authentication. Those types of things are all within the purview of what I think people are working on in this management phase. And I think as we start to move through this, we'll get a better understanding of what are the winners in terms of the technology in those areas, and what are the number one things that people are doing to really preserve that employee engagement. But I think it really is coming down to focusing on that people aspect and addressing that first. Otherwise, you risk staining your employee experience for quite a long time, I'm afraid.
No, it's great insights and great feedback. And I know even me personally, right, your lines between when the workday starts, when the workday ends, especially when you work across geographical locations, all of those things really coming into play. So I will say that is one of the big focus areas we have done within the Citrix Workspace, is really taking that people-centric approach. And maybe I'll tie it in a little bit more to the challenges that we saw that kind of provoked us to take this more people-centric approach. And I know I'm very guilty of this myself, but we've started to observe that it's almost like when I'm going to work, I have application overload. I have so many applications, so many different tools that I need to context switch between to get my job done. I like to teasingly say, when you get to my age, you walk into a room and sometimes feel like, oh, I don't remember where I walked into this room. I have that experience sometimes with my applications. Oh, I was going to this application and then I'm overloaded with inbox notifications and flashing things on screens. And I'm like, why did I go and launch this application again? I don't know if maybe I'm a little older than you, Andrew, so I'm not sure if you're having that experience.
I have it too. And the data says 23 minutes to regain your focus after that too. So I'm guilty of that all the time.
No, you could see how there's so much opportunity to accelerate productivity. And the other thing we really noticed was when you look at some of these applications, it's very interesting, right? You have to design an application for the power user. So I love to use this example just because in a business world, it's so relevant. When I walk up to a copier, there are tens of buttons, tens of hundreds of buttons that are laid out for that super power user that has all these advanced requirements. Whereas when I come to that copier, I'm such a simpleton. I just want to do one thing. I just want to push the button and have it copy. And I just like to use this analogy because I think it's a really great example. Even with some of the applications I use, they actually have to create guides for me and how to navigate through that application to be able to use it. So one of the other big investments we've been making into the Citrix Workspace is this intelligent experience. And just to walk through it at a very high level, we are introducing virtual assistant capabilities. I always use this example of, if it's like a Surrey for work, I need to schedule a conference room. I need to figure out what, whose office is on what floor. I need to find the vacation calendar. All those things I can now engage with from a personal assistant to help accelerate my productivity. And then the other item, which is where you see outlined in orange, that number 2, this is what we're really focusing on to help with that context switching. So instead of requiring me as the user to go into every single application, I'm actually bringing the actions that are required within that application to me. So here we have this concept of a resource feed or a personalized feed. And these are actually the list of action items or notifications from a variety of a variety of business applications that are all presented right here for me. So I can move very quickly through those assigned tasks. I don't become the bottleneck without ever needing to go into that individual application. So we're very excited about that technology. And then you can see there, the blue component, the number 3, those are things you might do very quickly within another application. Put in a support ticket, request PTO. Now I can do that all right here within the UI. And of course, I still have access to all my business resources. So my virtual, my SaaS, my web applications, my mobile applications, all my files, my virtual desktops, everything that I need to get my job done is consolidated for me right here within the workspace. So really focused on accelerating user productivity.
One of the things I really like about that too is, we think about what drives employee engagement at work. And, it's really a balance between two things. One is the demands that I have on my time and my job and the things that I have to do and the resources that I have to meet or overcome those demands. And I think right now there are so many additional demands that balance is just completely out of whack for a lot of employees. So the more that you can kind of automate, that you can reduce some of the things that people need to do, whether it's context switching or how quickly they can access apps or take specific actions, you're freeing up more time, you're providing that better resource. So that definitely resonates with me. The fourth phase that we've been talking about is eradication. And this is the phase that is least clear, right? Because we don't know when we're going to get a vaccination. And this is really the key marker for eradication. We know that pre-pandemic conditions are not going to be restored here. We know there's going to be permanent shifts in the way that people do business. And really, it comes when that vaccine is readily available. So this could be, as it says up here, April to June 2021, which I think is a pretty conservative estimate based off what I've been reading. But it could also be earlier too. And you want to start thinking about, okay, what does that future workplace actually look like? How do I keep employee engagement high in this world that is completely different? And, I want to offer basically just two major thoughts here about what you should be doing to ensure that you can capitalize on this unique opportunity to embrace remote working and flexible work styles. One is we've always talked about, 4 imperatives of remote work. And I mentioned at the beginning of the call that I've covered this space for a number of years now, since 2017. And there's really 4 imperatives to remote work, which are structure, culture, technology, and compliance. And you do need some type of program in place, a formal program to make sure that this works correctly. Ad hoc kind of remote working programs don't work. They provide a lot of ambiguity. They can breed jealousy amongst employees, all sorts of different things. So as you start thinking about the future, you'll want to start thinking about these 4 categories of your remote work strategy. And how do I ensure that I have good policies, good norms, good leadership in order to support all of these things? So I think one of the major takeaways for a lot of organizations is particularly on this structure piece. Can I give specific types of work styles to employees to enable them to be much more flexible? And we've seen this in a number of customers over the years. Some of the ones that are featured in the older report are companies like Dell and USAA and Humana, who have these defined work styles, whether it's someone that is in the office a couple of days a week, at home most of the time, in the office all the time, a flex worker that comes in late or leaves late, someone that works a 4-day work week. At the end of the day, a lot of these companies see value in terms of, can I provide a set structure so that I have better options for people, but also so I can be agile if I need to move people remotely very quickly. People have that muscle memory, right? It's a really important capability to build. And you can start thinking about what technology you provide to those different types of people based off of those work styles as well, which also has occurred. So the structure piece, I think, is one of the big takeaways. Organizations are going to have to at least address remote working in some way and provide some level of experience. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really hard to make this transition going forward. On the culture side of things, I've been having a lot of conversations with folks around training leaders to support a much more outcome-based culture rather than a task-based culture, because the task-based culture where you're really looking at, is someone showing up? Are they completing X number of emails? Are they attending certain number of meetings or doing certain number of transactions? Those types of things aren't necessarily indicative of productivity. And therefore, they really don't work in a remote work scenario. You need to think about cultivating an outcome-based culture if you really want to invest in more flexible work styles. And of course, the technology piece is something that we talked about quite a bit. I won't go into detail there, but essentially we're thinking about more scalable technologies, leveraging cloud, and focusing on automation capabilities that can help reduce some of the burden on employees. And of course, compliance is another area that's always really important, and particular countries having certain needs for how you pay them and when you pay them and how people set up their workspaces. So that'll be increasingly important as we go forward. And the second major point, in addition to just actually building some structure into your remote workplace flexibility program, is around this digital workspace capability, right? So this is how I've represented the digital workspace at Forrester, is that it's a collection of various technologies that are all integrated together and have an impact on employee experience and on productivity. We used to think, I think a lot of organizations think about mobile as smartphone, as tablet, as form factor, and being able to move around with that. But it's really the full suite of technologies that people are using. We're looking at a mobility strategy for the digital workspace so that no matter where you are, you have that superb technology experience. So what I'm urging a lot of clients is to think, it's not acceptable to have degradations in the end user experience based off your location, right? You might have some network things, like if you're connecting in a Starbucks or something like that, but at least in terms of the overall infrastructure, how you're enabling people, one of the big takeaways for this is really think about how do you build parity across all of those different locations that people are accessing information, getting their jobs done, collaborating with peers. The days of bifurcated technology experience, whether at home or in the office, are long gone. I think that's the biggest impact for a technology organization going forward, is it needs to be the same and it needs to be great no matter where you are. So that's my major takeaway and what I've been telling a lot to clients about as well.
Yeah, that's a great slide, Andrew. Really, I think shows it all together in one cohesive picture. I really value having that for sure. So now as we kind of look here at all the information you've provided, all the insights from all the customer conversations, what are some of the long-term impacts of remote working in this post-pandemic world? And really, what are your guidelines to help organizations prepare?
Yeah, so I would say there's kind of four major ones. The first one is we're definitely going to see an increase in remote working. I don't think it's going to be 100% at all. I'm talking to clients, pretty much every day who are saying we want to bring people back or people want to go back. Only about 50% of the U.S. population that we surveyed as part of Pandemic EX said, I actually just prefer working at home. So there are people out there that want to go to the office. So if you hear claims out there that say we're going to be 100% remote all the time, it's just not going to happen, in my opinion. I think organizations are going to have this hybrid model essentially, but they're going to have to deal with that hybrid model by having more of that structure, like I talked about earlier. So I see overall increase, but not 100% transition. Changes in physical offices. I think this is going to change. The whole pandemic and the rise of remote working is going to change how we use offices. So I've been talking to a lot of clients where they're basically saying, the office is not really a place where you go and just do heads down work and get things done anymore. The office is the place where you go to collaborate, to have that in-person connection, to see people that you care about in the workplace, and to really emphasizing the benefits of that in-person interaction. So I think we'll see more offices change their layouts to be much more focused on those collaboration pieces and a reduction of kind of personal spaces for people to do heads down work. Of course, there'll still be some of those. You'll still have to have a percentage there, but I think that overall shift in real estate will be much more focused on the collaborative pieces of this in general. And we've seen examples of companies like TCS, for example, where their CEO basically came out and said, we're only going to expect 25% of our workforce to be in the office at any given time. The rest of the time they'll be at home. So that's a huge sea change. It's really going to affect how we organize offices. cultural norms, I think that's going to be an area that I think is going to be really interesting. Our advice for a lot of clients right now is incentivize the use of personal protective equipment, have people make fun masks and have contests over it. That's a huge cultural change of actually wearing a mask to work, let alone things like handshakes. Personally, I'm hoping for the death of the handshake, but we'll see if it happens. So things around cultural norms, conferences, all of these things are up in the air. I think we're going to have a huge impact on that. And finally is overall changes in the environments too, and more of a focus on it from organizations. There's been a big focus on sustainability from building perspective for quite a while, but I think one of the things we've seen with this pandemic is, how much certain environments have cleaned themselves up, or have got less polluted, or have had less emissions, those types of things happening. So I think that one of the long-term effects of this remote work is a broader societal change and a broader environmental change in terms of how this is applied. And I certainly hope that's the case, and that we learn a lot from all of this. So those would be my 4 major ones.
No, those are great. I appreciate the insight. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. I think it's been a great conversation, just kind of tying together where we've been, where we're at, where we're going. Obviously from the Citrix side, highlighting some of the technology capabilities that we have to help you throughout this journey. And I think at that point, we'll wrap it up. I will actually toss it back to Darlene and see if we've had any questions come in.
Thank you, Carissa. Now, as we move into the Q&A, I would like to remind our audience that if you have a question, please submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. Simply type your question into the text box and then hit submit. Seems like we have a couple of questions in queue. I'll start with the first question. How should organizations think about employee communications going forward? How can they level the playing field between remote and in-office employees?
So I can take a first stab at that, which is I think there's more focus on asynchronous types of communications going forward, where you really need to document and write down everything that you're disseminating to employees. I think in the past there was, a big focus on, hallway conversations, kitchen conversations, and in this new world of hybrid, that's just not going to be acceptable, because what we find with a lot of remote work programs is the remote workers feel like they're being left out of important decisions and sometimes being skipped over for promotions and things because they're not privy to the information that's shared in between meetings. So I think one of the big takeaways for this is focusing a lot more on asynchronous communication, operating in a low context environment. In other words, being very direct, providing as much information and detail about something as possible. So I think that'll be a major shift for organizations communication-wise.
Oh, that's great feedback. I don't know that I have much to add, Andrew, other than I think that's even just as an IT manager, you can see how that becomes even relevant and more tentative to the remote workers. You're much more empathy rather to their situation, and making sure that you are aware and communicating with them as much as possible. Appreciate that. Sorry, Darlene, back to you.
Our next question is, what should organizations be thinking about the regard to physical offices? Should we be redesigning physical offices now that we'll have more remote workers?
That's certainly been something that's been talked about. There was a great article came out just a few days ago, nationwide out of the US, closed, I think it was 5 offices. Because they'd sent the people home, they thought, well, we don't really need this anymore. 1, it's safe, and 2, it costs us a ton of money. And we're starting to see some conversations where people are saying, well, we just don't need physical real estate anymore. So that's one element. The other element is, for the vast majority that are going to keep some type of footprint, you reduce the amount of time, you reduce the amount of personal desk space. You move more towards a hot desking environment where people reserve desks. That gives you more capability to sanitize those areas as well, and it also allows you to reduce the number of people that you have in the office at any given time. So I think there'll be a change in kind of the overall desk structure, as well as providing obviously social distancing within those environments as well. One of the big issues that I'm hearing from clients is, if we have to put all of these things in place in order to make people feel safe, is it really worth it? Are they even going to feel safe? So some organizations have been saying, we can put in all the different things that we need, temperature scanning, social distancing, sensors, all of this stuff. At the end of the day, if the people don't feel safe, they're not going to take risks at work. They're not going to innovate. They're not going to be productive. So there is this fine balance between what should I do with the physical office to make it as safe as possible, but not so apparent that you're trying to make it safe that it becomes kind of distracting or breeds anxiety for people that you bring back. So it's an evolving discussion for sure.
All right, we have 2 more left in queue. So our next one is, we hear a lot about zero trust. What does that mean, and how does it apply to remote working?
So, we hear a lot about zero trust as well. And, basically what you're doing, with zero trust is verifying, the health of every single component in the stack. So device health, application health, verifying that the user is who they are, and using a combination of different signals to determine whether someone has proper access to something. You are doing least privilege access. So when I was talking about earlier about the VPN access, traditional, device-wide, network-wide VPN is not least privilege. Least privilege. It is providing full access to everything just based off the authentication. In a least privileged zero trust environment, you only give access to the things that people need. So only a specific application someone would have access to. So that zero trust mentality is really about, one, verifying all the different components that people are accessing your system with, but also making sure that you're not giving undue access to people that don't need it.
Thank you so much. Alrighty, and now to wrap it up, we have our last question, which is, if we're interested in cloud desktops, what should our approach be to migrating or adopting them?
Do you want to take that one first, Carissa?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to chime in. So, in making that transition to cloud-hosted desktops, if you are, I'll maybe frame it in the context of a Citrix customer, and then Andrew, leave it to you to kind of go a little bit more broadly or across just strategy overall. So one of the biggest advantages that we have is, obviously, if you've made an investment in Citrix technology and you're interested in transitioning to our cloud services, we do have options where you can work with your sales representative to help take that investment and actually transition it over to leveraging our cloud service. So that's a huge opportunity, because the other thing I like to highlight is it's the same technology stack that we're using in our on-premises environment as well as in the cloud. So all your knowledge simply ports over, and then you have that ability to leverage the cloud service. You can do your on-premise applications you already have today, and then as you're looking to add in cloud hosted, you need to scale to address, a situation we just discussed. You have all that flexibility. So then I'll hand it over to you, Andrew, maybe to take a broader look.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are a couple of things to think about. And one is, what's your experience with virtualization too? I think, if you are an existing customer and you want to make that transition, there are pathways for you to do that. If you are a new customer, oftentimes the new customers to virtualization prefer the cloud approach, in my opinion, because it can be easier to stand up overall. And companies like Citrix and others are going to have managed capabilities where they'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So it can be a good way to get up and running very fast, right? And the other thing to think about is, what personas and things are you targeting this for? A lot of times the cloud desktops are really good where you need a lot of scalability really quickly. Your remote workforce is a great example. Your distributed workforce that might be in different countries or something. We see it with call centers a lot of the time. Seasonal workers during tax season, those types of use cases. So a lot of it is upfront doing some employee listening and figuring out, okay, what do these different groups need? What are their major challenges? And how can I form fit the right virtualization strategy for those people? And in some cases, it might make sense to use, existing, on-prem virtualization solution, if you have specific applications that you have to have on-prem, things of that nature. So there are a lot of considerations to it. I would say a lot of the new customers have been thinking about the managed cloud deployment. just for ease of use and not having to manage the on-prem infrastructure. But it can go either way depending on how long-term you're thinking about that strategy.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I would like to thank Carissa and Andrew for a very informative presentation, and also thank our audience for joining us. Just a quick reminder, you can check out and register for upcoming webinars and events by going into citrix.com/events. We hope you have a wonderful day.